Across the rolling hills and winding rivers of medieval Europe, castles began to rise not simply as homes for kings or warriors, but as powerful symbols of protection, control, and confidence in a world where safety depended on stone walls, watchful eyes, and carefully chosen high ground. From a distance, a castle appeared almost like a promise carved into the landscape because its towers suggested shelter for villagers below, its walls hinted at order amid uncertainty, and its flags quietly announced who held authority over fields, roads, and surrounding lives. Castles were rarely placed by accident since builders carefully selected hills, river bends, or crossroads where trade passed, armies slowed, and visibility stretched far enough to offer precious warning before danger could grow teeth. Early castles were often made of earth and timber rising quickly from wooden palisades and packed dirt because speed mattered when threats were close and resources limited. Even the later generations would replace these materials with stone meant to last longer than memory. As stone castles spread, they reshaped how people imagined power because thick walls, narrow gates, and towering keeps turned defense into architecture, allowing fewer soldiers to hold ground against larger forces. Inside those walls, life unfolded in layers, with noble families living in upper halls, guards pacing ramparts, servants managing kitchens and storage, and animals sharing space that blended daily survival with long-term planning. The central keep stood as the heart of the castle because it offered the last refuge during attack, stored valuables, and food, and symbolized authority through height, strength, and the quiet message that someone was always watching. Moats, whether filled with water or left dry and deep, added another obstacle that turned simple approaches into complicated problems, forcing attackers to slow down while defenders gained time, confidence, and better angles. Drawbridges transformed entrances into controlled moments because they could welcome allies with ceremony or cut off enemies with dramatic finality, often changing the mood of an entire valley with a single movement. Castle walls rarely stood smooth, since towers and crenellations broke their lines, giving defenders protected spaces from which to observe, signal, and respond without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Life in and around castles was noisy and busy, with hammering from repairs, voices echoing across courtyards, and the constant movement of people who understood that these structures were both homes and machines of defense. Villagers living nearby depended on castles during danger, bringing supplies inside during raids, while offering labor, food, and loyalty during calmer times in exchange for protection and stability. This relationship tied castles deeply to local life because they were not isolated fortresses, but centers around which farms, markets, roads, and communities slowly organized themselves. While castles shaped the landscape, knights shaped the stories because these mounted warriors carried expectations of courage, loyalty, and skill that captured imaginations far beyond battlefields. A knight's journey often began young, as boys trained first as pages, learning manners and basic skills before becoming squires responsible for horses, armor, and observing combat up close. Through years of service, squires absorbed lessons about discipline, honor, and survival because knighthood demanded more than strength, requiring trust, patience, and the ability to follow complex social rules. Becoming a knight was marked by ceremony where swords, oaths, and public recognition transformed personal effort into social identity that carried both privilege and responsibility. Knights fought on horseback when possible, since speed and height offered advantages, yet they also trained to fight on foot, knowing battles rarely followed neat plans or ideal conditions. Armor evolved constantly, from chainmail to plate, balancing protection with movement because surviving combat meant staying flexible as much as staying covered. Weapons varied depending on region and purpose, including swords, lances, maces, and shields, each chosen to match tactics, terrain, and personal preference. Despite the shining image later stories would create, knightly life involved hard training, physical discomfort, and long periods of waiting that tested patience more than bravery. Knights served lords through oaths of loyalty, creating bonds that linked military service with land, reward, and obligation rather than wages alone. These oaths formed the backbone of feudal relationships, binding castles, knights, and peasants into systems where mutual dependence replaced centralized control. Honor played a central role because reputation shaped opportunities, alliances, and trust, influencing how knights were treated both on and off the battlefield. Chivalry emerged as a set of ideals rather than strict rules, blending expectations of courage, loyalty, mercy, and respect into a cultural story that knights were expected to live up to, at least in public. Tournaments offered controlled spaces where knights could display skill, earn prizes, and gain fame without the chaos of real war, though injuries remained common and risk never disappeared. Crowds gathered eagerly for these events, enjoying spectacle, rivalry, and storytelling that turned individual fighters into local heroes or dramatic cautionary tales. Castles hosted these gatherings, transforming from defensive spaces into social centers where music, feasting, and competition softened stone with human energy. Noble courts inside castles became places of education and culture, where poets, musicians, and scholars found audiences alongside warriors. Stories told in great halls shaped values, teaching lessons about loyalty, betrayal, bravery, and consequence through entertaining narratives rather than lectures. Women in castle life managed households, oversaw supplies, and sometimes governed estates during absence or conflict, exercising authority that required intelligence, diplomacy, and resilience. Their influence extended beyond domestic spaces, shaping alliances through marriage and negotiation that strengthened political networks. Children growing up in castles learned hierarchy early, observing how power flowed through service, ceremony, and proximity to authority. Meals reflected status because seating, food variety, and access to luxuries quietly reinforced social order with every shared feast. Food storage mattered as much as feasting, since survival during siege depended on careful planning, preservation, and understanding seasonal limits. Water access shaped castle design, with wells placed securely within walls to prevent disaster during long defenses. Cleanliness posed challenges, yet systems for waste, ventilation, and hygiene evolved gradually to keep enclosed spaces livable. Castles required constant maintenance because weather, use, and time slowly wore down even the strongest stone. Stonecutters, carpenters, and laborers therefore remained essential, turning castles into ongoing projects rather than finished monuments. Signals such as banners, horns, and fires connected castles across distances, allowing warnings and messages to travel faster than messengers alone. These networks created a sense of shared defense, linking individual strongholds into regional systems of awareness. While castles symbolized stability, they also reminded people of conflict's constant possibility, shaping behavior through visible preparedness. Knights trained continually, understanding that readiness mattered more than display because real danger rarely arrived with notice. Horses received careful attention since a knight without a strong mount lost mobility, advantage, and identity at once. Stables therefore held status equal to armories within castle grounds. Armorers worked closely with knights, customizing equipment for balance and comfort because poorly fitted gear endangered its wearer as much as any enemy. Practice yards echoed with clashing and shouted instructions as skill grew through repetition rather than theory. The rhythm of castle life blended tension with routine because vigilance coexisted with farming, celebration, and quiet evenings by torchlight. Castles overlooked villages not just to dominate, but to observe the lives they protected and depended upon. Over time, castles influenced how people imagined safety, power, and belonging within a fragmented political world. Knights became symbols of order within that world, linking violence with responsibility through cultural expectation. Together, castles and knights formed a partnership between stone and human ambition, shaping landscapes, stories, and identities that would define the medieval imagination. As the foundations of castle life settled into tradition, the world within those walls continued to adapt, preparing the ground for changing warfare, evolving ideals, and new challenges that would test whether stone and honor could endure together. As castles and knights became familiar sights rather than surprising innovations, people began to understand them not only as defenses or warriors, but as systems that shaped behavior expectations and daily rhythms across regions where safety and authority were never taken for granted. Castles slowly evolved from purely military structures into administrative centers because lords needed places to collect taxes, hold courts, store records, and host negotiations that determine how land and labor were organized. Within castle halls, decisions affecting entire communities were discussed beside roaring fires, where alliances were weighed carefully, disputes were settled through persuasion or compromise, and power often depended on personality as much as position. Written records became more common inside castles, since keeping track of land grants, service obligations, and agreements helped prevent conflict, even though memory and reputation still carried enormous importance. Knights played roles beyond fighting because they acted as messengers, witnesses, and local representatives of their lords, carrying authority into villages and along roads where written orders rarely traveled. This combination of military skill and social responsibility meant that a knight's behavior mattered constantly, since honor gained or lost in public life could strengthen or weaken an entire household's position. Training therefore extended beyond weapons, including learning etiquette, negotiation, and restraint, because surviving politically often mattered more than winning individual battles. Castles hosted courts where justice blended law with custom, allowing lords to mediate disputes while reinforcing their role as protectors rather than distant rulers. Punishments often aimed to restore balance within the community using fines, service, or reconciliation rather than constant imprisonment. These practices helped maintain order where resources for strict enforcement were limited. Castles also influenced warfare itself because attacking strong stone walls required patience, planning, and specialized knowledge rather than simple force. Sieges became slow contests of endurance, where starvation, morale, and engineering mattered as much as weapons. Defenders relied on stored food, water access, and teamwork, while attackers tested walls through persistence rather than immediate assault. This reality shaped military thinking, making negotiation and compromise practical solutions instead of signs of weakness. Knights involved in warfare learned that battles were rare compared to waiting, guarding, and watching horizons for movement. When conflict erupted, coordination mattered more than individual heroics, reminding everyone that stories often simplified experiences that were actually complex and uncertain. Castles adapted over time, adding thicker walls, angled surfaces, and improved gatehouses as knowledge spread and technology advanced gradually. Each new design reflected lessons learned from earlier conflicts rather than sudden invention. Local materials influenced appearance, giving castles unique shapes that tied them to their landscapes. Stone from nearby quarries, wood from local forests, and labor from surrounding villages made each fortress a regional creation. This connection reinforced loyalty because people saw their own work shaping protection. Daily life inside castles balanced routine with readiness since guards rotated shifts, messengers arrived unpredictably, and maintenance never truly ended. Firewood, food supplies, and repairs required constant management. Cooks fed entire households using seasonal ingredients, creating meals that followed tradition more than novelty. Music and storytelling softened long evenings, reminding listeners of values and shared identity. Religion remained present, with chapels inside castle walls providing spaces for reflection, ceremony, and reassurance. Priests blessed warriors, mediated disputes, and marked important moments, weaving faith into daily structure. Festivals transformed castles briefly, filling courtyards with laughter, color, and visiting performers. These events strengthened bonds between nobles and commoners. Children growing up within castle walls absorbed lessons through observation, learning hierarchy, patience, and ambition without formal instruction. Their play mirrored adult roles, turning sticks into swords and walls into imagined battlefields. As they matured, expectations settled naturally through environment. Outside castles, villages adapted to their presence, providing services, labor, and goods while gaining markets and protection. Roads improved near strongholds, encouraging trade and movement. Travelers sought shelter beneath castle towers when danger threatened. Over generations, some castles grew into towns, blurring lines between military and civilian life. Knights too experienced change, as ideals of chivalry became stories told more often than realities practiced. Peaceful periods tested relevance, pushing knights toward governance, ceremony, or service beyond combat. Some embraced learning, joining courts as advisors rather than fighters. Others sought adventure through tournaments or distant campaigns. Armor and weapons gradually adapted to new threats, balancing tradition with innovation. Horses continued to define mobility and status. The bond between knight and mound remained essential. Despite romantic stories, exhaustion and injury shaped careers quietly. Retirement often meant managing land or training others. Castles stood as witnesses to these personal journeys, absorbing memories into stone. They watched families rise and fall. They outlasted individual ambitions. Over time, castles became symbols of history itself, reminding later generations of earlier struggles. Knights entered legends, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes misunderstood. Together, they formed images that still shape how the Middle Ages are imagined. Yet beneath stories remain practical systems built for survival and order. Castles and knights represented cooperation between architecture and human organization. They balanced force with responsibility. They tied power to place. They transformed landscapes through presence. As the medieval world continued to evolve, these systems prepared societies for change, ensuring that stone walls and sworn loyalty would leave lasting foundations for the centuries that followed.